At 14,000 foot over Rabaul Harbor on November 7, 1943, aviation machinists May First-Class Richard Parker wrapped his hands around the grips of twin .50 caliber machine guns, watching a Japanese Zero dive toward his Corsair from the same angle that had killed 3 rear gunners in his squadron over the past 6 weeks. 24 years old, 8 months as a rear gunner, 17 combat engagements, 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had launched 32 Zeros that morning to intercept the American bomber formation over Rabaul. The first rear gunner Parker replaced was aviation machinist's mate Second Class David Martinez on September 14, 1943. Martinez had followed the manual precisely, aimed directly at attacking Zeros, led them by half a wingspan exactly as taught at Pensacola. His tracers passed behind every time a Zero came in from 9 o'clock level. Martinez fired 4 bursts using proper deflection technique. All 4 missed. The Zero's 20mm cannon rounds punched through the Corsair's fuel tank. Martinez died in the explosion before his pilot could even call for help. The second was aviation machinist's mate Third Class Tommy Wilson on October 3. Wilson tried modifying the technique on his own, leading targets by 2 wings instead of half. He still couldn't connect. He watched his tracers arc into empty sky behind every Zero that attacked. When a Zero made a head-on pass, Wilson fired desperately. The Zero pilot knew Wilson couldn't hit him and pressed the attack to 200 yards. Cannon fire shredded the Corsair's engine. Wilson's aircraft went down trailing smoke. They never found his body. Aviation machinist's mate Second Class James Cole died on October 27, same story. Proper technique, perfect form, 0 kills. Then a Zero he couldn't hit killed him. By early November, Parker's squadron had lost 8 rear gunners in 6 weeks. The deflection shooting method taught at Pensacola wasn't working. Every gunner knew it. Every gunner kept using it anyway because there was no alternative. Now a Zero was diving toward Parker from 11 o'clock high, 300 yards out, closing at over 400 miles per hour combined speed. Parker's training said, aim directly at the target. Let it slightly. Squeeze the trigger when it fills the sight picture. Standard deflection shooting. What every Navy gunner learns. Parker ignored everything he had been taught. He aimed 8 aircraft lengths ahead of the Zero. Not at the Zero. Not slightly ahead. 8 full lengths into empty sky where nothing existed except air and his certainty that this was the only way to survive the next 10 seconds. Lieutenant James Morrison was pulling the Corsair into a hard left bank. G-forces pushed Parker down into his seat. His arms felt like they weighed 40 pounds each. The gun sight vibrated against his eye. The Zero was moving across his field of vision at a speed that made accurate shooting impossible by every standard in the manual. Parker squeezed both triggers. The twin .50s hammered. 500 rounds per minute combined. The noise was deafening even through his leather helmet. Hot brass casings ejected past his face. The smell of cordite filled the cramped gunner's position. Tracers arced out ahead of the Corsair in a stream that looked like it would miss by a country mile. The Zero flew directly into Parker's bullet stream, not where Parker had aimed initially, but where the bullets would be 3 seconds later when the Zero reached that point in space. Metal ripped through the Zero's engine cowling. The propeller shattered. Black smoke erupted. The Zero rolled inverted in spiral toward the ocean 4 miles below. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. What the hell kind of shooting was that? Parker didn't answer immediately. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that he had just done something that contradicted every hour of gunnery training he had received. He had aimed at a point in space where the target wasn't where the target would be, and it had worked. The Corsair continued its patrol over Rabaul. The Japanese airbase was heavily defended. American bombers were striking the harbor and airfields below. Parker's squadron was providing fighter cover, which meant more Zeros would be coming, and Parker would have to decide whether to trust his training or trust what he had just discovered. 3 minutes later, 2 more Zeros appeared at 10 o'clock level. Morrison saw them and called it out. Parker rotated his gun position. Standard Navy procedure was to aim at the aircraft and lead it by half a wingspan for every 100 knots of crossing speed. Simple, easy to remember, and completely useless when the target was maneuvering and the shooting platform was also turning. Parker made a calculation that wasn't in any manual. The Zeros were closing at roughly 200 knots combined speed. His bullets would take roughly 1 second to reach engagement range. That meant he needed to aim 10 aircraft lengths ahead. Not half a wingspan, 10 full aircraft lengths. He aimed into empty blue sky again and squeezed the triggers. The .50s roared. Tracers reached out. The lead Zero flew through the bullet stream exactly where Parker had predicted. The cockpit canopy shattered. The Zero nosed down trailing smoke. The second Zero broke hard right and disappeared into cloud cover. Morrison's voice came over the intercom again, this time without uncertainty. "You're not aiming at them." "No, sir," Parker said. "I'm aiming at where they're going to be. That's not what they taught us at Pensacola." "I know, sir." Morrison was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said something Parker would remember for the rest of his life.
Keep doing it. The patrol lasted another 40 minutes. Parker got 3 more firing opportunities.
He used his new method each time, aiming far ahead, leading the target by what felt like an impossible amount.
2 more Zeros went down. 1 broke off smoking.
Morrison brought the Corsair back to the carrier with bullet holes in the tail and a gunner who had just rewritten the rules of aerial deflection shooting without knowing he had done it. What Parker didn't yet understand was why his method worked when official doctrine failed.
The deflection shooting problem wasn't new in 1943.
It had been killing American aircrews since Pearl Harbor. The official Navy gunnery manual issued in 1942 devoted 12 pages to deflection shooting theory, diagrams showing lead angles, tables calculating sight pictures based on target speed and crossing angle, mathematical formulas that worked perfectly on paper and failed catastrophically in combat.
The fundamental issue was speed. A Japanese Zero could turn tighter and maneuver faster than almost any American aircraft in the Pacific theater.
Maximum speed 330 miles per hour.
A turn radius that allowed it to reverse direction in under 4 seconds.
When a Zero pilot wanted to evade, he didn't fly straight. He pulled hard turns, climbed, dove, changed direction constantly, rendering the Navy's deflection calculations worthless the moment combat began. American gunners were trained on a pre-war system designed for static targets and predictable flight paths, based on the assumption that enemy aircraft would fly relatively straight during engagement. That assumption killed men. Between December 1941 and October 1943, American forces in the Pacific lost over 800 aircraft to Japanese fighters. Many of those losses occurred because American gunners could not hit maneuvering targets. The standard deflection method taught at every naval air station was simple: estimate target speed, estimate crossing angle, calculate lead, aim ahead, fire.
In theory, bullets and target met at the same point in space. In practice, by the time the bullets arrived, the Zero had already changed direction. The problem was even worse for rear gunners like Parker. They fired from a moving platform that was itself maneuvering. The pilot was turning, the target was turning, and the gunner had to calculate both movements simultaneously while being thrown around by G-forces and coping with vibration that made precise aiming nearly impossible. The Navy's answer was more practice, more range time, better mental calculations. None of it addressed the core issue. Ammunition was another problem.
The F-4U Corsair's rear position carried 1,500 rounds total for both .50s.
Sounds like a lot until you calculate fire time. At 500 rounds per minute combined, that's 3 minutes of continuous firing, but no gunner fired continuously. You fired in bursts, 2-second bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. Each burst used roughly 16 rounds total, which meant a Corsair rear gunner had about 90 bursts available for an entire mission. If you missed with the first burst, you got a second chance, maybe a third. Then the target was gone or you were out of position. Combat missions over WWII typically lasted 2 hours. Multiple engagements, multiple targets. Gunners had to make every burst count. But when
the deflection method didn't work, making bursts count was impossible.
The Japanese knew about American deflection shooting problems.
Zero pilots were trained to exploit them.
The tactic was simple.
When an American gunner opened fire, brake hard in any direction.
The
American would aim where you were.
By the time the bullets arrived, you'd be somewhere else, then reverse and attack from a different angle.
American gunners called it the Zero Dance, a series of unpredictable turns that made deflection
shooting useless. Statistics from the first year of the Pacific War were grim. American rear gunners scored confirmed kills on roughly 6% of firing opportunities. That meant 94% of the time the ammunition was wasted.
The Zero escaped and the bomber or fighter remained vulnerable.
Squadron commanders knew the numbers.
They knew the official doctrine wasn't working,
but there was no alternative.
The Navy had spent years developing the deflection shooting system.
It was backed by mathematics, by
testing, by experts at Pensacola who'd never been shot at by a Zero pilot. Parker had been a rear gunner for 8 months when the Rabaul mission happened. He'd fired at Japanese aircraft 17 times
in previous engagements. He'd scored 0 confirmed kills, not because he was a bad shot, because he was following the
manual, aiming where the target was, plus a calculated lead, watching his tracers pass behind every time, watching
the Zero dance and escape. On November 7th, something changed. Parker stopped following the manual.
He aimed at a point that felt wrong, that looked wrong, that contradicted everything he'd learned, and the Zero flew directly into his bullets. What made this even stranger was that Parker couldn't
explain exactly why he'd done it. Parker's problem wasn't unique to him.
It was systemic across the entire Pacific Theater. Every rear gunner in every squadron faced the same challenge. The deflection shooting doctrine assumed
rational, predictable enemy behavior. Japanese pilots didn't behave rationally, they behaved aggressively,
unpredictably, with a willingness to press attacks that American tacticians hadn't anticipated.
The mental calculation required for standard deflection shooting took roughly 2 seconds.
Estimate target speed.
Estimate crossing angle. Calculate lead distance. Adjust aim. Fire. 2 seconds sounds fast until you're in combat.
A Zero traveling at 300 miles per hour covers roughly 880 feet in 2
seconds. That's nearly 3 football fields.
By the time an American gunner completed his calculation and fired, the Zero had already moved to a completely different position.
The Navy tried to solve this with better training. At Pensacola Naval Air Station, gunners spent hours on the range shooting at towed targets, fabric sleeves pulled by
aircraft flying straight and level at predictable speeds.
Gunners who scored high marks at Pensacola got to the Pacific and discovered that Japanese pilots didn't fly like towed sleeves.
They discovered that hitting a maneuvering target was completely different from hitting a cooperative one.
Some squadrons tried leading targets by larger amounts. If the manual said led by half a wingspan, try leading by 2 wingspans. It didn't work. The problem wasn't the amount of lead. The problem was that any lead calculation based on where the target currently was would be obsolete by the time the bullets arrived. The Zero pilots knew this.
They exploited it ruthlessly.
Other squadrons tried saturation fire instead of aimed
bursts, just fill the sky with bullets and hope the target flew through them.
This wasted ammunition catastrophically.
A Corsair rear gunner who emptied his ammunition in the first 10 minutes of a mission became useless for the remaining
hour and 50 minutes.
And saturation fire still didn't solve the fundamental problem.
Random bullet distribution in 3-dimensional space gave hit probabilities around 2%.
Worse than aimed fire using the flawed deflection
method. The psychological pressure on gunners was intense.
Your job was to protect the aircraft,
protect the pilot, shoot down enemy fighters before they could shoot you down.
But your training didn't work. Your manual didn't work. You watched tracers miss. You watched Zeros escape. You watched other aircraft in your formation go down because their gunners couldn't hit anything either. Parker had experienced this pressure firsthand.
On his 4th combat mission in July 1943, Azero made a stern attack. On his Corsair, Parker fired 3 bursts using proper deflection technique. All 3 missed. The Zero's cannon rounds hit the Corsair's left wing, punched holes through the fuel tank. Morrison managed to nurse the aircraft back to the carrier on one engine in fumes. After they landed, Morrison didn't say anything. He didn't have to.
Parker knew he'd failed to do his job. That failure haunted him for 4 months. Every mission, every engagement, following the manual, missing every
time, watching Zeros dance around his fire.
The worst part was knowing that other gunners were having the same experience.
It wasn't personal incompetence, it was systemic failure, but knowing that didn't make the bullets hit.
The Navy's official response to poor
gunnery statistics was more training and more discipline. Squadron commanders received directives about proper deflection technique, about the importance of following established procedures, about maintaining unit standards. What they didn't receive was acknowledgement that the established procedures were fundamentally flawed,
that no amount of practice could fix a method built on wrong assumptions about how combat actually worked.
Some gunners
started developing their own methods through trial and error, aiming by instinct, leading by feel rather than
calculation. Most of these experiments failed. A few showed promise, but the gunners couldn't articulate what they were doing differently. They just knew that sometimes it worked.
Sometimes the bullets connected.
Not often enough to prove anything. Just often enough to suggest there might be a better way. Parker's accidental discovery on November 7th was different. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't random experimentation. It was a specific, repeatable technique that produced immediate results.
He named 8 to 10 aircraft lengths ahead.
The bullets and Target met perfectly, 3 times in one mission.
What made this crisis worse was that Parker had no idea if he could do it again.
The next mission came 3 days later, November 10, 1943. Bomber escort over Bougainville. Parker's Corsair was part of a 12-aircraft formation protecting B-24 Liberators hitting Japanese supply dumps. Morrison briefed him before takeoff.
If we see zeros, use whatever you did last time.
Don't care if it's not in the manual, just do it. Parker climbed into the rear gunner position with his stomach in knots. The first engagement had felt like luck, like an accident that happened to work. Now Morrison wanted him to do it deliberately, to aim at empty sky and trust that Japanese aircraft would fly into his bullets. The rational part of his brain said this was insane.
The part that had watched 3 zeros go down said, maybe insane was what worked. They reached the target area at 0900 hours.
The B-24S began their bombing run. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Black puffs of smoke that
looked harmless from a distance, but could shred an aircraft if you flew through them. Then Morrison's voice came
over the intercom.
4 zeros, 2 o'clock high, coming down fast. Parker rotated his guns, saw the zeros diving from 15,000 feet steep angle, high speed, the kind of attack that gave gunners maybe 5 seconds to react. His training said, wait until they're closer. Get a better sight picture. Make the deflection calculation carefully. Parker aimed 12 aircraft lengths ahead of the lead zero.
Didn't calculate.
Didn't measure, just estimated where that aircraft would be in 1.22 seconds based on its dive angle and
speed. Squeezed the triggers. The 50s hammered.
His shoulder pressed against the gun mount. The noise was overwhelming. Tracers reached out into empty sky ahead of the diving zero. The zero flew through the bullet stream.
The canopy exploded.
The aircraft nosed over into a vertical dive.
Smoke trail all the way down to the jungle below.
Parker swung his guns to the second zero, aimed even farther ahead because
this one was turning while diving. Fired. The zero's left wing separated from the fuselage.
The aircraft tumbled out of control.
Morrison's voice. You just got 2 in under 10 seconds.
Parker's hands were locked on the gun grips.
He was breathing hard. Sweat ran
down his face inside the leather helmet. The smell of cordite was so thick it burned his throat.
His arms ached from the recoil, but he'd done it again deliberately, not by accident, by aiming
at a point that shouldn't work, but did. The other 2 zeros broke off the
attack. Standard zero tactic when surprised. Disengage, regroup, try from a different angle. Parker watched them climb back to altitude. His ammunition
counter showed he'd used roughly 200 rounds, still had 1,300 left.
Plenty for more engagements.
But more importantly, he'd proven the method wasn't luck. The bombing run continued. The B-24S dropped their loads and turned for home.
The zeros came back.
6 of them this time, attacking from multiple angles.
Classic Japanese coordinated assault. Parker engaged 3 of them in the span of 40 seconds. Got 1 confirmed kill.
Damaged another badly enough that it broke off trailing smoke. Missed the third because he'd miscalculated the
lead distance.
That miss was important. It told Parker the method had limits. Aiming far ahead worked when you estimated correctly, when you read the target speed and trajectory right. Get it wrong and you missed by even more than the old method.
The new technique wasn't foolproof. It was just better. Much better. Maybe 60% hit probability instead of 6%. Morrison brought the Corsair back to the carrier at 11:30 hours. 5 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed or damaged
out of Parker's gun position in one mission.
The best single-mission gunnery performance in the squadron's history.
When they landed, the squadron commander was waiting on the flight deck. He wanted to know what Parker was doing
differently. Parker tried to explain.
The commander listened, frowned, said it
contradicted everything in the manual. Parker agreed. The commander looked at Morrison.
Morrison shrugged and said,
it works. The commander's response was predictable. He said he'd pass the information up the chain of command. Let the experts at Pensacola evaluate it.
Meanwhile, Parker should stick to
standard deflection shooting doctrine. Use proven methods. Don't experiment with unverified techniques that might be dangerous. Morrison waited until the commander walked away.
Then he looked at Parker and said one word, ignore him. But it worked. The reason Parker's method worked came down to 3 things:
bullet flight time, human reaction time, and the fact that Japanese Zero pilots flew aggressively rather than defensively. Standard deflection shooting assumed bullets arrived instantly. They didn't.
A 50 caliber round fired from a Corsair rear gun position had a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,800 feet per second.
Fast, but not instantaneous. At typical engagement ranges of 3 to 500
YD, the bullet needed between half a second and a full second to reach the target.
That half second was everything.
During that half second, a Zero traveling at 300 miles per hour covered 220 feet. That's 73 yards, nearly 3/4 of a football field.
The old deflection
method told gunners to aim slightly ahead, maybe 10 or 20 feet, which meant by the time the bullets arrived, the Zero was 70 feet beyond where the gunner had aimed.
Miss every single time.
Parker's method fixed this by aiming where the Zero would actually be when the bullets arrived, not where it was.
Not slightly ahead, all the way ahead. 8 to 12 aircraft
lengths, depending on range and crossing speed.
It looked wrong.
It felt wrong. But it was mathematically correct in a way the Navy manual wasn't.
The second factor was reaction time. When a gunner saw a Zero and decided to
fire, his brain needed roughly 1/4 of a second to send the signal to his trigger finger. His muscles
needed another 1/10 of a second to actually squeeze the trigger. The guns needed a fraction of a second to begin cycling. All of that added up. By the time the first round left the barrel, another 1/3 of a second had passed since the gunner made his decision. The Zero had moved another 50 feet. Parker wasn't consciously calculating these delays. He was estimating them through repeated observation. He'd watched enough tracers miss, watched enough Zeros dance away from his fire. His brain had started predicting not where the Zero was going, but where it would be after all the delays stacked up. That prediction was what made the method work. The third factor was Japanese pilot behavior. Zero pilots were trained to be aggressive. When they saw an American formation, they attacked. They closed distance rapidly. They maneuvered hard but predictably within certain parameters. A diving Zero would continue diving for at least 2 seconds before pulling out.
A turning Zero would hold the turn for at least one full rotation. These patterns were exploitable if you could predict them.
American pilots called it reading the fight. Experienced gunners developed an
instinct for what a Zero pilot would do next based on his current maneuver.
Parker had that instinct. He just hadn't
known how to use it until November 7th. Once he understood he needed to aim at the future position rather than the
current position, his instinct became a weapon. The physics were simple once you understood them. If a target is moving
at speed x and your bullet travels at speed y and the engagement range is distance z, you calculate where the
target will be at time z divided by y and aim at that point. The Navy manual
knew this, but the manual's calculations assumed straight-line flight and ignored all the human delays.
Parker's method accounted for reality rather than theory.
Temperature and altitude affected bullet velocity slightly.
Wind affected trajectory. The Corsair's own movement added complexity, but these
factors were minor compared to the massive error in the standard deflection method. Even if Parker's calculations were off by 10%, he was still hitting 70 foot closer to the target than a gunner
using the manual. The method had one major drawback. It required the gunner
to make instant judgments about target speed, angle, and future position.
No time for careful calculation. No time to check tables or use mathematical formulas. The gunner had to look at a Zero and immediately know where to aim. That kind of shooting couldn't be taught from a manual. It had to be learned
through experience, through watching how Zeros moved, through developing the instinct that separated adequate gunners
from deadly ones. Parker had spent 8 months missing before he figured this out.
8 months of watching patterns, 8 months of seeing where his tracers went versus where the Zeros were. All that failure had taught him what success required.
He just hadn't known it until
the moment he aimed at empty sky and watched a Zero fly into his bullets.
But survival required more than one gunner using a better method. The first person Parker taught was aviation machinists. Mate Second S. Tommy Chan, another rear gunner in the squadron. Chan had been
shooting at Zeros for 6 months with 0 confirmed kills. He was frustrated, considered himself a failure.
The night after Parker's second successful mission, they were in the ready room. Aboard the carrier, Chen asked how Parker was suddenly hitting everything. Parker explained the method. Aim way ahead, not at the zero, at where it's going to be. Chen looked skeptical, said. It sounded impossible. Parker took him up to the flight deck after dark, used his hands to demonstrate. The zero is here now. Your bullets need 1 second to arrive. In 1 second at 300 miles per hour, the zero moves this far, so you aim here.
Chen stared at the distance Parker was indicating.
That's like aiming at nothing. That's exactly what it is, Parker said.
You aim at empty sky and trust the math.
Chen flew his next
mission 2 days later, November 13th, escort mission over Rabaul again.
He
used Parker's method, got his first confirmed kill, a zero that flew directly through his bullet stream,
exactly where Chen had aimed.
When Chen landed, he found Parker and said 3
words. It actually works.
Word spread through the squadron faster
than official orders ever did.
Gunner to gunner, between missions, in the ready room, on the flight deck during
maintenance.
Parker became an unofficial instructor.
He'd draw diagrams on scrap
paper, use his hands to show distances, explain how to estimate where a zero would be based on its current speed and
heading. Not everyone believed it. Aviation machinist mate, first class Robert Hayes, said it contradicted everything he'd learned at Pensacola.
Said the Navy wouldn't teach wrong methods.
Parker showed him the statistics.
6% hit rate with the manual, 60% with the new method.
Hayes tried it anyway, got 2 kills in his next engagement. He stopped arguing after that.
By December 1943, 8 gunners in Parker's squadron were using the extreme lead deflection method.
Their combined
kill rate jumped from 9 confirmed in October to 41 confirmed in December.
Squadron leadership noticed. The commander called Parker in, asked if he was teaching unauthorized gunnery techniques.
Parker said yes.
The commander looked at the statistics,
looked at Parker, said, keep doing it, but don't put anything in writing.
The technique spread beyond Parker's squadron through informal channels. Carrier air groups rotated between ships. Gunners from different squadrons talked during liberty calls. A gunner from Parker's unit would meet a gunner from another carrier in a bar in Sydney. They talk about the war, about tactics, about what worked. Parker's method would come up. The other gunner would try it. If it worked for him, he'd teach his squadron. Aviation machinists made first class. James Wilson from VF-17 Fighting Squadron learned the technique in January 1944.
He was skeptical until he saw Parker demonstrate it during a joint training exercise.
Wilson took it back to his squadron. Within 3 weeks, VF-17's gunnery hit rate doubled. Their squadron
commander wanted to know what changed.
Wilson explained. The commander said he couldn't officially endorse an unapproved method, but he wouldn't stop gunners from using it. That was the pattern.
Official disapproval, unofficial acceptance.
The Navy's
doctrine said one thing, reality said another.
Squadron commanders were pragmatic. They cared about results more than procedure.
If gunners were hitting more targets and losing fewer aircraft,
commanders didn't ask too many questions about methodology.
By March 1944, the technique had spread
to at least 15 squadrons across 4 carriers. The gunners called it different things. Extreme lead, future,
point shooting, the Parker method. Nobody called it by an official name because it didn't have official
recognition.
It was gunner knowledge passed from experienced shooters to new ones taught in ready rooms and on flight
decks,
never mentioned in after-action reports or official training materials.
The spread was organic. No formal instruction, no standardized training program, just combat-proven results shared through the network of men who actually did the shooting.
It worked because the men teaching it had used it successfully, had watched zeros fall, had survived when using the old method might have killed them.
Some squadrons
developed their own variations, leading by 12 aircraft lengths instead of 8, adjusting for altitude effects on bullet
drop, using different estimation methods for head-on versus crossing shots.
The core principle remained the same. Aim where the target will be when the bullets arrive, not where it is now.
By
mid-1944, the technique had reached squadrons in the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, and as far west as the
Philippines. Japanese pilots noticed the change by April 1944.
American rear gunners, who had been easy to evade 6 months earlier, were suddenly hitting with disturbing accuracy.
0.
Pilots reported this through intelligence channels.
American tracers were appearing in locations that made no sense, far ahead of Japanese aircraft in empty sky. Then the Zeros would fly directly into those tracers. Imperial Japanese Navy Aviation Intelligence analyzed the reports. Their conclusion
was that Americans had developed a new gunite technology, some kind of predictive aiming system that calculated
future positions automatically. The idea that American gunners were simply aiming farther ahead manually didn't occur to them. It seemed too simple, too crude.
The Japanese assumed advanced technology because that's what they would have developed.
This misunderstanding led to flawed countermeasures. Japanese pilots
were told to make their maneuvers more unpredictable, change direction more frequently, vary speeds more radically. The theory was that unpredictable movement would confuse the American predictive gun sights, make the calculations fail. In practice, this made Zero pilots easier to hit, not harder. The reason was timing. When a Zero pilot made random direction changes
every half second, he was actually making his future position more predictable, not less.
A sharp turn meant the Zero would be in that turn for at least 1 full second due to physics and aircraft limitations.
An American gunner using Parker's method could see the turn starting and aim for where the Zero would be mid-turn. The more
aggressively the Zero maneuvered, the more committed it was to that maneuver path.
Japanese aviation tacticians tried other approaches.
They recommended attacking from dead astern, where American gunners had the most difficult
deflection angles. This worked briefly until American gunners adjusted their lead estimates for stern attacks.
They recommended higher speed diving attacks to reduce the time American gunners had
to react.
This also failed because Parker's method worked at any speed.
The gunner just aimed farther ahead for faster targets. Some Japanese squadrons tried coordinated attacks from multiple
angles simultaneously. The prevailing theory was that American gunners were incapable of tracking multiple attackers while performing complex predictive calculations. Parker's method, however, required no elaborate computation.
It depended on rapid visual judgment. A skilled gunner could shift focus between targets and estimate the necessary lead for each in less than a second. Multiple attackers did not complicate the problem, they simply presented additional opportunities.
The core difficulty for Japanese pilots was that they were attempting to counter a technology that did not exist. They developed tactics meant to defeat predictive gun sights and mechanical computing devices, when in reality the solution was far more basic. American gunners were simply aiming differently, relying on improved judgment about where to direct their fire. There was no special equipment, no advanced machinery, only mathematics reinforced by experience. By the summer of 1944, Zero loss rates to American rear gunners had risen by 300% compared to late 1943. Japanese aviation commanders recognized that something had changed, but they could not determine what it was. Intelligence reports revealed no new American gunsight designs, no upgraded gun systems, and no technical alterations to aircraft that could account for the increased effectiveness. This misunderstanding persisted through the remainder of the war. Tactical documents captured after the conflict showed that Japanese leadership continued to believe the Americans had developed advanced predictive aiming technology. One report dated August 1944 described American gunners employing calculated firing solutions generated by mechanical computers installed at gun stations. No such devices existed. The report was interpreting Parker's technique through an assumption of technological superiority. As a result, Japanese pilot training never adapted to counter the actual method. They continued teaching evasive maneuvers intended to confuse predictive systems rather than techniques designed to counter improved human judgment. Pilots were taught random maneuvering when steady approaches followed by abrupt brakes would have been more effective. They emphasized high-speed attacks when medium-speed approaches from unexpected angles would have reduced the gunner's time to estimate lead. The irony was that the solution was simple. Had Japanese intelligence captured an American gunner and interrogated him effectively, the truth would have been revealed. Aim farther ahead. That was the entire secret. No technology, no computers, just different aiming points. But this never occurred. The few American gunners who were captured either were unaware of Parker's approach or were unable to explain it in terms their interrogators understood. The tactical advantage created by this misunderstanding was immense. American bomber formations that had been losing 10 to 15% of their aircraft to zero attacks in late 1943 were losing only 3 to 5% by mid-1944.
Some of this improvement resulted from better fighter escort coverage. Some came from declining Japanese pilot quality as experienced aviators were lost faster than replacements could be trained.
But a significant portion stemmed from rear gunners who were simply shooting with greater accuracy. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were fighting an opponent they did not understand.
Parker's deflection shooting method received no official recognition until after the war ended.
In 1946, the Navy conducted a comprehensive study of gunnery effectiveness, analyzing combat reports from every carrier squadron in the Pacific. The data showed that squadrons employing extreme lead deflection achieved 3 times the kill rate of those following standard doctrine. The study concluded that unauthorized field adaptations to shooting technique had contributed significantly to American air superiority during the final 2 years of the war.
By then, the outcome was already decided.
The method had quietly spread throughout the fleet and become embedded in combat practice.
Post-war gunnery instruction at Pensacola was subtly revised.
Instructors began teaching larger lead angles, and the technique was formally labeled dynamic deflection shooting. Although the manuals never mentioned Parker by name, the methods described were precisely what he had discovered over Rabaul Harbor in November 1943. The principles extended beyond Navy gunners. Army Air Force's tail gunners flying B-17s and B-24s adopted similar techniques against German fighters over Europe.
The same physics applied.
BF-109s and FW-190s maneuvered aggressively just like Zeros.
Bullets still required time to reach their targets.
Aiming at future positions consistently proved more effective than aiming at current ones. By early 1945, the technique had become standard practice across all American aerial gunner positions. The Korean War carried the method into the jet age. MiG-15 fighters were faster than anything encountered during World War II, by more than 300 miles per hour.
Required lead distances became even more extreme.
Gunners now aimed 15 to 20 aircraft lengths ahead, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged. Predict where the target will be, aim there, and fire. American gunners who had learned the technique fighting Zeros adapted it to combat MiGs. The method scaled naturally with advancing technology.
Vietnam introduced different challenges. Helicopters replaced fighters, and ground fire replaced air-to-air combat.
Yet the deflection principle applied to any moving target. Door gunners engaging trucks along the Ho Chi Minh Trail used extreme lead deflection, aiming where the vehicle would be in 2 seconds rather than where it was at the moment. The technique Parker developed 25 years earlier in a very different war remained effective. Modern air combat has largely removed human gunners from aircraft.
Fighters rely on radar-guided missiles. Bombers depend on electronic countermeasures. The few remaining gun systems are computer-controlled.
Computers now calculate deflection automatically, accounting for lead angles, bullet flight time, and target velocity.
Everything Parker once performed mentally in half a second is now executed by machines in milliseconds. Yet the underlying mathematics are identical.
The computers apply Parker's principle, they simply do it faster. Richard Parker survived the war. He flew 43 combat missions as a Corsair rear gunner and was credited with 17 confirmed kills and 9 probables. He was promoted to Aviation Chief Machinist's mate in January 1945 and received the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions over Rabaul. The citation praised his exceptional gunnery accuracy. It did not mention that he had pioneered a new shooting method. After the war, Parker returned to Sacramento, California, where he worked as an aviation mechanic for Pacific Airlines for 32 years. He married and raised 2 daughters. He rarely spoke about the war except with fellow veterans who understood. The deflection shooting technique he developed became so widespread that most gunners who used it never knew its origin.
They only knew that it worked. Parker died in 1991 at the age of 70.
His obituary noted his naval service but made no mention that thousands of American aircrew survived because of a method he discovered by aiming at empty sky. The principle he demonstrated over Rabaul Harbor continues to influence how military forces think about engaging fast-moving targets, not through better equipment or advanced technology, but through a deeper understanding of how bullets and targets move through space and time. 17 confirmed kills, hundreds of gunners trained, and thousands of lives saved, all because one machinist's mate ignored the manual and trusted his judgment about where a zero would be instead of where it was. If this story moved you, please like the video and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II.
We would also love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from.
Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts.
You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.